I can still hear the clink of the wine glass when my father said it. 2 days, Tara. You have 2 days to get your stuff out. My name is Tara Benson. I'm 29 years old, and I work as a freelance graphic designer from the small home office I carved out in the corner of my parents' guest room. I've lived here ever since my grandfather passed, the man who raised me more than anyone else in this family ever did. People say I'm quiet, maybe too quiet, but when you grow up around voices that only get louder when you disagree, silence becomes its own kind of armor. I was comfortable with my small routines: early morning coffee, client calls, and tending to the rose bushes my grandfather planted. That house was more than home. It was my safe space, my last link to him. It was supposed to be a family dinner, the first one in months. The candles flickered on the table, throwing gold light across their faces. Mom's roast chicken filled the room with that warm, nostalgic smell that used to mean comfort. But that night, everything tasted like betrayal. Before I continue my story, tell me, if your own family turned on you over a house, would you walk away quietly or make them remember who really built it? I remember blinking at him, thinking I'd misheard. The sound of my fork against the plate felt too loud. "Get my stuff out where?" I asked, half laughing, trying to fill the silence that suddenly hung between us. Dad didn't smile. 2 days, Tara. You have 2 days to get your stuff out. That's when my mother looked down at her napkin. She couldn't even meet my eyes. And my brother, Ethan, leaned back in his chair like it was nothing. He smirked, tapping at his phone, pretending to be bored. It was so rehearsed, so casual, as if they hadn't just shattered the last bit of home I had left. I tried to breathe, but the air felt thick. "You're selling the house? Why now? You told me—" Mom cut me off. "It's time for us to move forward, honey. You're almost 30. You should have your own place by now." Almost 30. That's how they dismissed the years I spent helping around that house, paying half the bills when Dad lost his job, staying home to care for Grandpa when everyone else was too busy. Almost 30. As if independence meant cutting out love. I didn't argue. Not right away. I just stared at the framed photos on the wall, the same ones I dusted every week. There I was, in all of them. Birthdays, graduations, Sunday dinners. I thought family meant something. But sitting there, watching my brother's smug grin and my parents' rehearsed sympathy, I realized something I wish I hadn't. I wasn't family anymore. I was just in the way. Ethan finally spoke. "Look, Tara, it's not personal. I'm helping them handle the sale. I'll make sure you get some notice before the papers go through." That's when I knew this wasn't my parents' idea. It was his. I could see the way Mom glanced at him for approval, the way Dad cleared his throat before repeating the line. They were letting him play puppet master, and he enjoyed it. Something inside me went still. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just nodded, set my napkin down, and excused myself. In the kitchen, I stood by the sink and watched the lights from passing cars blur against the window. My reflection looked like a stranger, someone small, swallowed by silence. That was the moment I made a quiet promise to myself. If they wanted me gone, I'd go. But I wouldn't leave empty-handed, because they didn't know what I knew. They didn't know that the house they were trying to sell, the same house my grandfather built from scratch, wasn't theirs to sell at all. And I wasn't about to remind them. Not yet. I walked back into the dining room, smiled politely, and thanked them for dinner. The shock on their faces was almost worth the pain in my chest. By the time I stepped outside, the night air hit me like a clean slate. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. I looked up at the windows glowing behind me and whispered, 2 days? That's all I need. They had no idea what those 2 days were about to cost them.
The next morning, sunlight crept through the blinds like nothing had happened. The house felt the same. Same ticking clock, same scent of lavender from the laundry, but I couldn't look at it the same way. Every wall, every photo, every dent in the staircase held echoes of my life, and suddenly I felt like a guest in it. I made coffee like I always did, in the chipped mug my grandfather gave me when I started college. It had a faded mountain print and a crack running down one side, but it still held warmth better than any of the new ones Mom bought. That mug was like me, flawed but dependable. I sat by the kitchen window, watching dew gather on the rose bushes outside. Grandpa had planted them before I was born. He used to say, if you take care of the roots, the flowers will never forget where they came from. He was the reason I stayed here after college. Not because I couldn't afford to move, but because he was aging, and someone had to look after him. When I first offered, my parents were relieved. They told me it was temporary, just until they found a better assisted living option. But weeks turned to months, and months turned to years. And in that time, Grandpa and I found a rhythm. He'd sit by the porch reading his morning paper, and I'd bring him tea and listen to his stories about building this house brick by brick after the war. He used to pat my hand and say, one day this will all be yours, kiddo, because you care about it, not because you want something from it. I never told him, but those words kept me going. When he passed away 3 years ago, the house felt emptier, colder. My parents barely cried. They were too busy arguing about what to do with his belongings, who'd take what, how much the property was worth, how sentimental clutter needed to go. Ethan barely showed up for the funeral. He arrived in a designer jacket and left before we even reached the cemetery. It hurt, but I told myself to forgive. That's what family does, right? I kept living there, paying for repairs, mowing the lawn, even helping with the mortgage payments during the pandemic when Dad's construction business slowed down. My freelance work wasn't glamorous, mostly logos and product mock-ups for small startups, but it kept me afloat. I never asked for much in return. I just wanted peace. Peace, however, is something my family never allowed to last. Ethan had always been the golden one, the one who had potential, who just needed time. My parents saw in him what they wanted to see, a reflection of their hopes, not the reality of his choices. He drifted from job to job, borrowed money he never paid back, and still somehow managed to be the hero of every family conversation. Mom would beam. Ethan's working on something big, a new business idea, while I would be quietly refilling everyone's glasses, trying not to roll my eyes. I used to tell myself they didn't mean harm, that favoritism was just old habit. But over time, it became harder to ignore. Dad treated me like an assistant, not a daughter. He'd ask me to handle things around the house, paperwork, errands, bills, like it was my duty. When I tried to set boundaries, he'd sigh, "You're too emotional, Tara. We're just trying to keep things organized." I learned to nod, to keep peace through silence. But silence has a way of turning heavy. Still, I loved them, or at least the version of them I thought I had. I told myself that love meant staying, helping, forgiving. I told myself I didn't need validation or thanks. But sometimes at night, I'd overhear them talking in the living room about how Tara should really move out soon, and I'd feel that familiar tightness in my chest, the kind that whispers, "You're overstaying your welcome." Even then I didn't leave, because deep down, I knew something they didn't. Months before Grandpa died, he'd asked me to help him organize some legal papers. In that cluttered study of his, he'd handed me an envelope, heavy, yellowed, sealed with tape. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Don't open this yet, but keep it safe, Tara. Someday it'll protect you." At the time, I thought it meant emotionally, that maybe it was a letter or family heirloom, but something about the way he said it, the deliberate calm in his voice, it felt heavier. I kept that envelope in the bottom drawer of my desk, beneath old sketch pads and tax forms. Never opened it, never needed to, until now. That morning, after the dinner, I pulled it out for the first time. My fingers trembled as I stared at it, still sealed, with his shaky handwriting across the front. For Tara, when the house no longer feels like home. I didn't open it yet. I just sat there, tracing the ink with my thumb, feeling tears build behind my eyes. It wasn't just a house to me. It was a history of scraped knees, birthdays under string lights, and nights spent sketching by the window while the smell of rain filled the room. I could still hear Grandpa's slow footsteps on the stairs, his soft whistle as he passed by my door. And now my family, my own blood, wanted to erase it for a quick sale. That day, as I sat on the porch watching the afternoon sun fall over the garden, I realized something. I'd been trying to earn love from people who only respected possession, and I was about to show them what it meant to lose it. They thought I'd crumble, that I'd cry, beg, or leave quietly. But grief can be a kind of clarity, the kind that makes you see what's really yours. And what's really yours, you don't surrender. I took a long breath, went back inside, and tucked the envelope into my bag. If my family wanted to turn this house into a battlefield, I'd fight. Not with anger, but with truth. And truth, in this case, was written in my grandfather's hand. Sometimes betrayal doesn't start with shouting. Sometimes it begins with a smile over dinner and ends with an empty chair at breakfast. But I wasn't planning to disappear quietly. I was planning to listen to every conversation, every lie, every careless word, until I knew exactly how deep this went. Because revenge, I was beginning to learn, doesn't always start with rage. Sometimes it starts with patience. The first real sign came 2 days later, a thin white envelope wedged in the front doorframe. No handwriting, just a printed label. Benson Property. Notice of sale preparation. At first, I thought it was junk mail, but when I opened it, I saw my brother's name, Ethan R. Benson, authorized representative. My hands went cold. There it was, in black and white. He'd already filed paperwork with a local realtor listing the house as under negotiation. And the worst part? My parents had signed it. I sat on the porch steps, staring at those signatures. My father's blocky scrawl, my mother's looping cursive, and for a long time I couldn't even breathe. It wasn't just betrayal, it was coordination. It meant this hadn't been a sudden decision at dinner. It had been weeks, maybe months in the making. They'd sat through family breakfasts, smiled across the table, asked me about work, all while secretly planning to erase my home from under me. That night, I confronted my mother first. She was in the kitchen, folding laundry with the hum of the TV in the background. "You already signed the house over, didn't you?" I asked quietly. Her hands froze mid-fold. "Tara, please don't start this again." "Again?" I said. "You told me at dinner. I'm not starting anything. I'm trying to understand why." She sighed, setting down a towel. "It's just business. Ethan's been helping us get things in order. You know how organized he is." Organized. That was one word for it. I stepped closer. "You didn't even tell me." You let me pay bills and fix things while you were selling it behind my back." She turned to face me, her tone suddenly sharp. "You're not a child anymore, Tara. We've supported you long enough. It's time for you to find your own place." Those words hit harder than I expected. "Supported me?" I whispered. "Mom, I paid half the mortgage for 2 years. I took care of Grandpa when you wouldn't even visit him in the hospital." Her lips tightened. "That's not fair." "No, it's not." The argument ended with her walking away, muttering something about ungratefulness. I just stood there, staring at the kitchen tile, realizing that fairness had never been part of this family's vocabulary. Later that night, I overheard them talking in the living room. I hadn't meant to, but when voices lower to whispers, your instincts tell you to listen. Mom said, "She'll be fine, Harold. She's always been too attached to that house." Dad's reply came slow and heavy. "I just hope this startup of Ethan's actually takes off. We're taking a risk here." Ethan laughed, a short, confident sound. "It will, Dad. Once the sale goes through, I can clear my credit and get investors on board. We're weeks away from the launch." That was the moment everything clicked. They weren't just selling the house to move forward. They were selling it to fund Ethan's business. My parents weren't gaining a fresh start. They were gambling their future, my home, and everything Grandpa worked for on my brother's latest fantasy. I should have burst into the room, demanded answers, shouted until they finally looked me in the eye, but I didn't. Instead, I backed away quietly and went upstairs. My hands were shaking too much to hold the railing. In my room, I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and typed Benson Property Deed Search. I needed to see it with my own eyes. When the document loaded, my stomach dropped. The house was listed under Transfer Pending, Executor, Harold Benson. It meant they were halfway through the process. And that's when I saw a small note under the legal section. Awaiting verification of secondary beneficiary clause. Those words lit a spark in me. Secondary beneficiary. I didn't know what it meant, not exactly, but it made me think of that yellowed envelope in my bag. The one my grandfather told me to keep safe. My pulse quickened. The next day, Ethan came by the house. Not to check on me, but to strut. He parked his shiny leased sports car right in the driveway and strolled in without knocking, sunglasses still on. "Hey sis," he said casually, glancing around. "Just wanted to make sure you're packing up. Got buyers coming for a tour soon." Buyers. He said it like I was already gone. I folded my arms. "You seem awfully comfortable playing realtor for a house that isn't even yours." He grinned. "It's not about ownership, Tara. It's about opportunity. You should try it sometime." I stared at him. "This isn't a business deal, Ethan. This is home." He shrugged. "Sentimental value doesn't pay bills. Look, you can come by for holidays if you want. We'll figure something out." That was his version of mercy, letting me visit my own memories. When he finally left, I felt something inside me harden. I wasn't the quiet, forgiving sister anymore. I was done being reasonable. That night, I took the envelope from my bag and opened it. Inside were 3 documents, all neatly folded. The first was a copy of my grandfather's will, and as I read the words, my hands trembled. To my granddaughter, Tara Benson, I leave full ownership of the family residence and surrounding property for her dedication and care during my final years. The second was a notarized letter from his attorney dated 5 years earlier, confirming that the deed had already been transferred into my name as per his living will. And the third was a handwritten note. If they ever forget who earned this home, remind them, not with anger, but with truth. For a long time, I couldn't move. I sat there under the dim light of my desk lamp, letting those words sink in. Every moment of betrayal suddenly felt smaller compared to this. A quiet, deliberate act of love from someone who had seen everything coming long before I did. Grandpa hadn't just protected me, he'd prepared me. The next morning, I called the number on the letterhead. Craig Wilson, attorney at law. His voice was calm, measured, the kind of tone that made you feel like you weren't overreacting. "Yes, Miss Benson," he said after verifying my details. "Your grandfather's transfer was executed properly. The title is legally yours, but it appears your parents and brother never updated their records. They likely assumed the property remained in your father's name." I swallowed hard. "So, technically, they're trying to sell a house they don't own." "That's correct," he said, "and if you'd like, we can move quickly to reaffirm ownership and put a temporary hold on any sale." It was like hearing the universe take a deep breath on my behalf. "Do it," I said quietly. "Please." As I hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in days. Control. Not revenge yet, not satisfaction, just the slow return of power. Downstairs, I heard laughter. My parents and Ethan chatting over breakfast, making plans, unaware of what had just shifted. The irony was almost cinematic. They thought I was upstairs crying, but I was upstairs reclaiming. That evening, Ethan came back with a realtor, a woman in heels and a bright red blazer who introduced herself with a fake smile. "Lovely home," she said, glancing around. "You've kept it in great condition." Ethan was practically glowing. "Yeah, my sister's been living here. She's just moving out soon." I stepped into the room. "Actually," I said faintly, "I'm not." The realtor blinked, unsure. "Oh, are you the current tenant?" I looked straight at Ethan. "No, I'm the owner." He laughed, too loud, too dismissive. "She's joking. Don't mind her." But I wasn't joking, and soon he'd realize that. It's strange how betrayal sounds when it echoes in the same rooms you once called safe. Every word feels heavier, every smile sharper. I used to think family meant unconditional love. Now I knew it could also mean unconditional entitlement. Still, I didn't confront them. Not yet. Because revenge isn't about making noise. It's about timing. And I had just begun to count the seconds. I didn't sleep that night, not out of anger, but because the silence felt different, heavier, watchful. The walls that once held laughter now held secrets, and I needed to see every one of them clearly. By morning, the first thing I did was search for Ethan's startup. He'd called it Nova Edge Technologies, something vague and futuristic enough to sound legitimate. The website looked polished at first glance, sleek design, flashy phrases like innovation for tomorrow. But when I scrolled to the bottom, I saw something telling. The contact email led to a Gmail account. No corporate domain, no team page, no investors, just him. It wasn't a company. It was a facade. Then I looked up the realtor he'd been working with. She'd listed several properties under priority family sales, all homes belonging to elderly couples or small families in our town. Ethan's name appeared as consultant on more than one listing. I sat back slowly, the truth dawning on me. He wasn't just selling our house. He'd been using other people's properties too, likely for referral commissions, money he probably pocketed to keep his illusion alive. I scrolled further and found a small business registry record dated 3 weeks earlier. Nova Edge Technologies. Owner, Ethan Benson. Initial capital,
$0. Crowd-funded projection. That was his grand plan. He'd conned our parents into believing he was on the brink of something big, when in reality, he was drowning. I printed everything: the documents, the registry, the website page, the email headers. I stacked them neatly on the table like evidence in a courtroom. Then I opened my grandfather's old file, the one with the property deed, and placed it on top. Truth, I realized, is quiet, but when you stack enough of it together, it makes a sound people can't ignore. A few days later, I got a call from Attorney Wilson again. "Ms. Benson, the freeze on the property sale has been processed," he said. "No legal transfer can occur without your explicit consent." I exhaled deeply. "So, if anyone tries to move forward?" "They'll be flagged immediately," he finished. "I'd recommend keeping your own copy of the confirmation." I thanked him, hung up, and slipped the printed notice into a folder marked Keep. By then, I wasn't angry anymore, just observant. Every small movement in that house seemed to tell me something new. Mom stopped mentioning the house sale altogether. She avoided the topic like an old wound. Dad looked nervous whenever Ethan came around. And Ethan, for all his bravado, had started showing cracks. He called more often, checking whether things were moving. And his voice carried that edge people get when they're desperate but pretending not to be. One evening, I stood by the window as he pulled into the driveway again. His engine idled for a moment before shutting off. I could see him in the reflection, tapping his phone screen, pacing. He didn't know I was already ahead of him. When he came in, I played along. "Hey," I said casually, "how's the launch going?" He gave a practiced smile. "It's fine. Investors are lined up, just waiting on the liquidity." "Liquidity," I repeated, pretending to think. "You mean money from the house sale?" His expression flickered, a split-second glitch before the mask came back. "You're still on that? Tara, you need to move on. This isn't personal." "It's home," I said softly. "How is that not personal?" He exhaled, annoyed. "I know you don't get it. I'm doing this for all of us. Once the company grows, everyone benefits. You think I'd just take everything and leave?" I didn't answer. I just studied him. The defensive tone, the jittery hand, the hollow confidence. He wasn't evil, just entitled enough to think his dreams justified everyone else's losses. When he left, I knew two things. He was running out of time, and he still believed I was powerless. That was exactly how I needed him to think.
By morning, I had a reply. "We can help. Please share your materials securely." I sent everything, every receipt, every signed document, every false record Ethan had used. Within 3 days, they confirmed my suspicion. Ethan had forged several advisory consent forms under my father's name, authorizing him to manage property negotiations. He'd even fabricated investor correspondence, fake emails between interested buyers that didn't exist. The report ended with one line that sealed his fate. "All transactions are unauthorized and fraudulent under local property law." I printed it and slid it into the growing evidence folder. Each page felt like a heartbeat, steady, patient, inevitable. The final piece came unexpectedly. Mom called me one afternoon, her voice small. "Tara, your brother's been asking if you'll be gone by the weekend. He said there's a new buyer." "There isn't," I said gently, "and there won't be." Silence. Then she whispered, "What do you mean?" I hesitated for a moment. "I mean, Mom, you and Dad have been misled. The house isn't yours to sell. Grandpa transferred it to me years ago." She didn't speak. I could hear her breath catch on the other end. "You can check the deed yourself," I continued softly. "I've verified everything with an attorney. Ethan's been using your signatures to prop up his scheme." She finally said, "That can't be true." But her tone said she already knew it was. When I hung up, I realized something profound. Betrayal doesn't always end with confrontation. Sometimes it ends in quiet confirmation, when truth lands heavier than any argument could. That night, I stood by the window again, the same one I'd once looked through in confusion, now seeing everything with perfect clarity. I used to believe family loyalty meant forgiveness at all costs, but I've learned that sometimes loyalty means standing firm, even if it means standing alone. The betrayal was complete, but so was my understanding, and that understanding would soon become my weapon. Planning felt weirdly like cleaning. There was a rhythm to it: gather, sort, label, file, and with each action, the clutter in my chest settled a little. Where my family had relied on impulse and charm, I would rely on systems and timing. Revenge, I decided, would be methodical. I started by making the evidence visible. Not for spectacle, for clarity. I laid everything out on the dining table under the kitchen light: the will, the notarized transfer, the attorney letters, the printouts from Nova Edge, the realtor listings, Carter and Associates report. I used colored sticky notes to tag issues: fraud, forgery, unauthorized transfer, realtor network. I photographed every page with my phone and backed it up to an encrypted folder. There is a small perverse comfort in digital copies. They don't wrinkle or get lost in the shuffle of emotions.
Then I called the people who mattered. Craig Wilson, my grandfather's attorney, agreed to be my legal anchor. His voice was low and steady on the phone. "We move quickly and quietly," he said. "First, we confirm the title and lodge a formal notice of contested transfer. Then we issue subpoenas where necessary. Your aim should be to prevent any closing, not to provoke. Let the law do the work." His cadence suited my plan: precise, unhurried, unshowy. Next, I messaged Leila Ortiz, my oldest friend and a real estate agent, with a calm, no-nonsense manner. I didn't tell her the whole story at once. I let her see the documents. She read in 30 seconds and then said, "We'll need a paper trail and witnesses. I can place a discreet hold on ad listings, and I'll talk to the realtor who came by. Let them think the sale is moving, but nothing can proceed without clear title." Leila's role would be to control the marketplace, to make sure Ethan's show would have no audience. Carter and Associates, the investigators my grandfather had weirdly pre-selected, became my quiet cavalry. Their report was already damning, but I hired them for one more thing: to trace the money. If Ethan had been siphoning referral fees or fabricating investors, there would be records somewhere: deposits, bank transfers, small payments that formed the nervous system of his illusion. They promised to follow the financial footsteps and deliver anything incriminating they found directly to Craig. Once my team was assembled, I built a timeline. I am a designer by training. Grids and timelines are second nature. I made columns: legal, financial, social, and tactical. Under legal, freeze on sale, notice of contested transfer, potential criminal referral for forgery. Financial, trace funds, identify commissions, freeze suspect accounts. Social, controlled disclosure to mom and dad through Craig, neutralize Ethan's narrative. Tactical, staged realtor visits to expose fraud, public-facing evidence only when legal wheels were secure. The tactical phase required choreography. I couldn't simply confront them with papers and expect truth to land. People who profit from lying are practiced at deflection. I needed to create a context where the truth could not be gaslit away. First, documents. Craig filed the formal notice disputing the sale. The county responded within 48 hours with a procedural freeze.
That legally prevented any title transfer until the dispute was resolved. I slept 2 nights without panic. The house breathed again. Second, controlled exposure. Leela agreed to set up another showing, but this one would be different. She would bring the same realtor who'd been pushing the sale and casually ask for proof of clear title. The realtor's script would be simple. We just need to confirm title to schedule an open house. That would prompt the realtor to ask Ethan for documents on the spot. He'd either produce them, in which case we watched for forgery, or he'd deflect and reveal panic. We'd give him no stage to spin a story. Third, financial pressure. Carter and Associates flagged a small web of transactions, payment to a consulting account that, when traced, led to a shell sub-account with transfers to Ethan's personal card. Craig helped prepare a subpoena to the bank. The idea wasn't to humiliate in public, but to secure incontrovertible proof that could not be explained away as good intentions. Paper follows money. Money never lies. Fourth, narrative control. I recorded voice notes, the same habit Grandpa had watched me keep, detailing events as they unfolded. Short entries. November 6, found listing. November 8th, filed dispute. They were dry, precise, without accusation. I asked Craig if I could share a single line from the will with Mom and Dad, not as a threat, but as incredulous fact. He agreed. A carefully worded attorney letter dropped like a cool stone into their lives. Per Mr. Benson's transfer, dated date, title is vested in Miss Tara Benson. No commentary. No flourish. The evening the realtor returned, the house felt like a stage set. Dim ambiance, low hum from the fridge, the steady tick of the wall clock. Ethan arrived confident, but when Leela, playing the professional, asked for proof of clear title, he faltered. He tried charm. It's being handled. He tried delay. We'll have papers next week. When Craig's subpoena arrived the following day, all the charm turned brittle. I watched him on the couch through the reflection in the window, the practiced ease dissolving into a man learning the rules had changed. But legal steps were only half the plan. The real psychological work was to make their choices visible to themselves. People who profit from others often live in a fog of rationalization. To clear it, you don't need to shout, you need to hold a mirror. So with Craig's permission, I arranged a meeting in the living room. Neutral, public, but intimate. Craig read the relevant parts of the will aloud, then the notarized transfer, then Carter's report findings. My role was small. Listen. Let the facts speak. Let their faces reveal what they already knew they'd done. Mom's hands shook. Dad's jaw clenched. Ethan's eyes darted like someone counting exits. The room was quiet in a way my family had never been when they spoke. No scripts, no rehearsed lines. Craig closed the folder and, in measured tones, explained the potential legal consequences for forging signatures. He didn't scream. He didn't moralize. He simply laid out the ledger of facts. That's when I felt the plan reach its center, not in vindictiveness, but in restoration. My goal was never to exile my family or to revel in their shame. It was to reclaim what Grandpa had given me and to show them the cost of choosing entitlement over care. There were other small moves, smaller and almost tender. I left copies of the will in places my parents would find them, a print on the kitchen counter, another tucked into Dad's car, a third slipped under Ethan's cereal bowl. It wasn't petty. It was necessary. Evidence that cannot be ignored becomes truth they must live with. By the time Craig filed the formal bank subpoenas and Carter came back with a ledger of sham transactions, the house had stopped being a battleground of whispers. The momentum had shifted. Their plan collapsed quietly, tooth by tooth, until there was nothing left to hold up Ethan's story. I recorded one last voice note that week, sitting at my grandfather's old dining table, as rain ticked against the window. They thought 2 days would be enough. 2 days is all for panic, not to undo a lifetime of preparation. It was not triumphant, it was factual, the kind of sentence that sits heavy and sensible in the mind. And because timing is everything, I waited.
I let the paperwork land. I let the law do its slow, precise work. When the final confirmation arrived, a formal letter reaffirming the title in my name and noting potential criminal referrals, I felt a soft, clean relief. Not joy like spectacle, but the quiet of a room where a long, painful conversation had finally been completed. If you're drawn to stories where calm turns to power, stay with us. Subscribe to Revenge Home for more tales of justice served quietly. Plans, I learned, don't have to be loud to be lethal. They just have to be right.
Revenge, in my mind, never looked like a movie. It didn't require dramatic confrontations, explosive revelations, or a public spectacle. It was quieter, surgical. By the time the legal wheels clicked into motion, the real work was to let truth land where it could not be denied, and to do so in a way that kept my own hands clean of theatrics. The first strike was procedural and invisible to anyone who relied on appearances: the county's administrative freeze. Once Craig filed the contested transfer, a clerical alert disappeared across the realtor network. Showing stalled. Offers evaporated into polite emails. Ethan called daily, voice a low chafe of forced calm, asking whether things were moving. I let him think his pressure would work. Let him breathe in the illusion of control, while the actual control quietly shifted away from him. The second move was exposure, but not the kind people crave. I didn't post photos online. I didn't send texts to shame. Instead, I orchestrated moments where the truth would interrupt their routines. Small ruptures that allowed facts to be acknowledged without a fight. On a Wednesday morning, Leela scheduled a routine inspection under the guise of preparing the listing. Ethan showed up in a crisp shirt, expecting an audience and a performance. Instead, Leela invited our longtime neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, in to get her opinion on the property for historical value. Mrs. Alvarez is a woman who remembers everything about our street. She watched Grandpa lay the first brick. When she mentioned with a soft certainty that Mr. Benson had once said the house would stay in the family, Ethan fumbled. He tried to redirect the conversation with charm. Charm bends under her steady voice. Small audiences mattered. They validated what legal paper could only state in a vacuum. People I'd tended to over the years, the mail carrier who'd known my grandfather, the gardener who'd mowed our lawn for a decade, began to look at Ethan with the kind of curious pity that ruins a performance. He wasn't the hero of our community. He was a young man trying to sell other people's memories. That social erosion, paired with Craig's legal pressure, did most of the heavy lifting. The third move was financial, and for him, lethal. Carter and Associates delivered the ledger that tied referral fees and fabricated investor deposits to Ethan's private accounts. Craig served a subpoena to the bank. I watched him on the couch that afternoon near the television when the real consequences arrived: the bank's legal notice and the cold letter from the accounting firm that had been asked to audit Nova Edge's investor relations. For a man who'd built his life on plausible stories, the word audit sounded like an executioner. He went pale as linen. But the cleanest moment came not from lawyers or ledgers, but from something simpler. Timing the revelation so my parents saw the truth before they could defend him. I didn't want them to discover his fraud from an angry confrontation. I wanted them to see, with their own eyes, the documents that proved what Grandpa had done and what Ethan had tried to undo. So Craig arranged a formal meeting in their living room. I sat there as he read in a calm, neutral voice the will, the transfer, the notarized confirmations, the investigators' findings. No commentary beyond the facts.
My father's face went from bewilderment to the slow reddening of guilt. My mother's hands covered her mouth. Ethan's mask, which had cracked in private, finally shattered publicly. He tried to talk, to explain, to charm, but Craig's tone turned legal and unyielding. The room's air became official. The neighbors' accounts, the bank letters, the formal freeze, they arrived in sequence like a chorus. Ethan left that night. He packed a duffel bag and walked out without dramatic accusations. He didn't fight. He didn't even threaten. He moved like someone who knows the choreography of failure and is trying to exit before the curtain falls. For a while, my parents sat in stunned silence, the kind you hear at wakes. I didn't gloat. I sat quietly, feeling the pall lift like a window opening after a storm. There were smaller, almost domestic triumphs that felt important. I returned items I'd maintained over the years to their rightful places. Grandpa's pocket watch to the side table, the framed certificate of the house's original mortgage to the mantel, as if placing them back was an act that sealed the reality of ownership. I left copies of the will where they would discover them in private, under Dad's Bible, tucked into Mom's sewing box. It wasn't cruelty. It was a steady insistence that truth be found in the places they touched most. What mattered to me beyond legal vindication was reclaiming the rhythms of home. Once the official letters confirmed the title, I asked Craig to draft a simple message to the neighborhood association explaining that the title was vested to me and that any transactions would be communicated through proper channels. It was bureaucratic and therefore effective, the kind of thing that removes drama and replaces it with procedure. I wanted normality, not spectacle. There was one confrontational moment I had planned but never needed. I'd rehearsed a calm conversation with Ethan in my head, not an accusation but a question. Why did you think I was expendable? I wanted to hear if he'd ever understood the cost of his ambition. But when he returned months later to retrieve some boxes, our exchange was smaller than I expected. He looked older, thinner, a little hollowed by consequences. He mumbled an apology that didn't ask for forgiveness, and I accepted it in the only way that felt honest. I nodded and handed him the keys to a drawer. No speeches, no show, just a closing of a drawer where our shared history once fit. The revenge had not been about punishment. It had been about restoration and clarity. When the legal dust settled and the bank letters and county records all reflected the truth, my parents had to rebuild their relationship with reality. They had to choose whether to support the man who'd misled them or to face the part they played in the unraveling. Some decisions were slow to come, others were immediate. My mother wept, not for what was lost, but for the trust she had misplaced. My father retreated into silence for a long while, then began attending counseling with me, a gesture small but meaningful. He learned, awkwardly, how to apologize. The community's reaction was a quiet mirror. The neighborhood that had once admired Ethan's style now offered small consolations. A casserole left on the porch, an envelope with a note of support tucked under my door. A few of Grandpa's old friends stopped by to recount stories about him, their voices soft with memory. I listened, recorded, and sometimes in my voice notes, I let gratitude slip in between entries of facts and dates. There was one final poetic flourish that felt almost accidental. A local journalist wrote a small piece about elder property rights after hearing our story from a neighbor. It wasn't sensational, it was practical and focused on the mechanisms that protect families. In the comments, someone praised my grandfather's foresight. Another reader wrote about the importance of paperwork. The article closed with a line that felt like the last chord of a song.
Care is a form of ownership. And when care is given, it is often more binding than any signature. I saved that line and read it back when I needed to remind myself why I'd fought. By the time winter arrived, the house no longer felt like a contested plot. It felt like a room with a future that began with me. Not because I'd won, though the papers said I had, but because the people I loved were now confronted with the consequences of their choices, and we could begin the slow work of repair. I didn't celebrate. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to the house breathe, to the pipes, the clock, the faint hum of a neighbor's radio. In the quiet, I let the truth take root. The revenge had been precise, measured, and ultimately kind. It restored what needed restoring, and it taught the rest what it meant to be held accountable.